Hi everyone. All right, so today I'm going to be talking to you guys about specifically which decade was the best for the field of learning, design, and technology. This is a difficult question to answer because the beginning decades set the stage for everything that would happen later, and the later decades only occurred because of what had been developed before them. I choose the 1950s for my answer, specifically because they built on what came before, and it really set the stage for a lot of amazing things that happened up to today, and that I am positive will continue to happen in the future. Now, when you talk about the 1950s, you have to talk about what came before. In the early part of the 20th century, you had educational media growing for the first time. And this led up to the audiovisual movement, which in turn was used on a large scale for the first time during World War II. From the years 1940 to 1945, over 457 training videos were shown to U.S. military troops. And this gave a huge validation to the audiovisual and just educational technology movement. Now, that set the stage for a lot of what happened during the 50s. Now, as we talk about why the 1950s were the best decade for the learning, design, and technology field, we're going to break that field down into three distinct areas. The first is media, the second is technology, and then the third is learning theories or instructional design itself. Each of these three areas contributed to building the 50s up as this just excellent decade for learning, design, and technology. So let's talk about media. After World War II showed that audiovisual training could be used with a high degree of effectiveness, the 1950s took this and updated it with the idea of educational TV. Now, this movement took off mostly due to two reasons. Number one, the Ford Foundation donated a freaking $170 million to the movement. That's going to encourage anyone. Also, the FCC dedicated 242 TV channels for educational TV. Now, the educational television movement resulted in some pretty neat ideas. One example of this was a community college in Maryland, which presented its curriculum in Chicago via public television. That's really cool, especially for the times, and especially considering how difficult distance learning had been previously. Well, hold on, you say. Didn't that educational TV movement fail, miserably? Yes, it did, absolutely. Like so many other movements, the radio education movement, and then even the computer education movement, which is very popular right now, did not take off as quickly as many people predicted. However, while the television education movement did fail, it really did predicate what we have now. You had distance learning going on, people in two different areas watching the same course, the same material. That's what we're doing right now. So even though we can do it much better now, we still, I feel, based what we're doing now on what came before. We updated it, we improved it, we made it better, and that's what evolution is about, and that's what the evolution of education is about, which is why I would list the television education movement of the 1950s as one of the reasons that the 50s is officially awesome. Next, let's talk about the technology of the 1950s LDT movement. So those of you who are voting for the 60s or the 90s as the best decade are not going to like this, but I'm afraid you do not have a monopoly on the internet. Because before the internet was the internet, it was ARPANET. And ARPANET was created by an organization called ARPA, which was founded during the 1950s. Part of what makes the 1950s so fascinating is the historical context that surrounds it. During the 50s, the United States was entrenched in the Cold War, and it was the events of the Cold War, particularly the launch of Sputnik in 1957, that led to the Department of Defense founding ARPA in 1958. ARPA's special mission was to make sure that no more surprises happened to the United States, but it was influential over quite a bit. As an article by Lukasik phrases it, ARPA's history and character lie at the heart of networking. ARPA's mission, along with its history and character, are what led to ARPA developing ARPANET in the 60s, releasing it in the 70s, and the creation of the World Wide Web in the 90s. Without the history surrounding ARPA, the internet that we have today could look very different, and the education internet-based technology that we have today would look very different as well. One of the other technological developments during the 1950s was IBM's pioneering computer-assisted instruction, also known as CAI. IBM created a CAI author language, and they also made one of the first computer-assisted instruction programs. Now, this combination of the foundation of ARPA and consequently the beginnings of the internet, as well as IBM's really just creating the beginnings of computer-assisted instruction, set the foundations for the influence of computers in education for the rest of the century and beyond. Finally, the 1950s led to great advances in learning theory. These advances were mostly due to B.F. Skinner, as well as Benjamin Bloom and the Russian launch of Sputnik. In 1953, B.F. Skinner published Science and Human Behavior, which advocated for teachers breaking instruction down into small, concrete steps. B.F. Skinner put his own advice to work when he made the teaching machine, which was a machine that slowed students down to only working on one practice problem at a time and then immediately receiving feedback after every problem. Obviously, we do not still use the teaching machine. However, today there are many programs available that will provide students with this frequent needed feedback. B.F. Skinner's ideas that he came up with in 1953 are still at work today, and they still have an effect even today. In 1956, Benjamin Bloom published Taxonomy of Educational Objectives, which advocated for creating and testing over learning outcomes. This is something that is still a best practice to the current times, and it has been very influential for both instructional design practices as well as educational teaching practices. Finally, Sputnik. When Sputnik launched in 1957, the United States went into full-on space race mode. Now, we already talked about how this affected the founding of ARPA. However, it also had huge effects on the United States education system because many people worried that the United States STEM programs were just not up to snuff. As a result, the federal government plowed huge amounts of money into science, technology, and math initiatives in the public education system. Now, come on, you say. This is just another example of the 50s failing yet again, because by the time the 60s rolled around, most of those science, technology, and math initiatives were shown to have failed. However, I would argue, as a matter of fact, this is what makes the 50s great. Because, yes, they tried things and they failed, but we learned through those failures. That's what we got from the 1950s. We got to learn from their successes, and we got to learn from their failures. Those technology, science, math initiatives failed, but because of that, the United States learned, hey, maybe we should test out curriculums before they're finished, and thus learn what we need to change before it's final. That is something that is excellent to learn, and that is something that has benefited many school children across many decades because of the failures of the 50s. In conclusion, the 50s was an amazing decade because they used what had come before them in order to create new ideas, technologies, and theories. Did some of these ideas fail? Absolutely they did, but that's what education is all about. Because in education, you research new ideas, you try them out, you scrap the ones that don't work, you rework the ideas that could work, and you continue building. And that is what has given us the education system that we have today. An education system that, by the way, is not perfect because we haven't reached a pinnacle yet. We're going to continue trying and striving in order to rebuild our education system and to make it better yet. And that is what the 50s is all about. And that is why the 50s is the best decade for learning, design, and technology, because they tried. They tried hard, and both their successes and their failures built a strong foundation for the future.